The telephone rings in the pastor's office. Hello, this is Agent so-and-so from the IRS, and we're wondering if you could help us. Butterflies in the pastor's stomach. I'll do what I can. Do you know Rick Stevens? Yes, he's a very good member of our congregation. Did he make a donation of $20,000 to your church? A smile comes across the pastor's face. He will now. Today we're completing our fall sermon series, Jesus on Money. Jesus had a great deal to say about money, more than just about any other topic. He talked about money for this reason, to encourage us to get a grasp on what is truly valuable in our lives. I think I can sum up what Jesus had to say about money today by introducing you to 4 incredible women. We know the names of 3 of them, the 4th we do not. These 4, as far as I can tell, followed the financial strategy we've been talking about these past few weeks. Here it is. Earn all you can. Save all you can. Give all you can. Let's meet these 4 smart and faithful women. First, the 3 women whose names we know. The 8th chapter of the Gospel of Luke begins with 3 verses that are not familiar. They're not part of the lectionary. I've never preached on them. There's no story there. There's no famous saying. It's just 3 verses that are a summary section and keep the story moving. What's interesting about these verses is they contain some background information that is really especially important. Luke presents Jesus to us as a traveling teacher, as an itinerant rabbi who would go from place to place and stop and then teach. And the message was this: Jesus proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. This was Jesus' topic. We'd go from place to place and person to person and point out the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is God's way, as opposed to every other way. The kingdom of God is God's way of love and God's way of grace and God's way of forgiveness and God's way to live. And this way, according to Jesus, is acceptable or accessible to all. Not just a few, but to everyone, rich, poor, male, female, Roman, Jew, wealthy, poor. These verses also tell us that Jesus didn't do this all by himself, that he did it with the 12. He traveled with the 12 and others. And these people are best known as disciples, although Luke doesn't use that word right here. Disciples are simply students. They are people who follow a teacher, follow a rabbi, attend to every word, and then try to live what the teacher is saying. Now, here's where this gets interesting. Luke tells us that there were women in the company of disciples. This was unconventional. Other rabbis did not include women in the company of disciples. Jesus did. And Jesus' ministry impacted 3 of these women in pretty spectacular ways. Luke tells us their names. Mary, called Mary Magdalene, She was released from 7 demons. Joanna, who is the wife of Herod's steward. Herod is the Roman governor. So Joanna is in the inner circle of Roman power, of powers that are active in governing this area. So that tells us she's following Jesus at great risk. This is no small thing. And the last one is Susanna. So there's Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna. And here's the other interesting detail. Luke now tells us that these 3 are providing for Jesus and his ministry out of their own resources. They're breaking the stereotype here. These women are not just cooking, providing meals, doing the typical things you would expect from women in that era. No, they are funding Jesus' ministry out of their own resources. They are contributing financially for whatever Jesus and the other disciples need, which means food, housing, footwear, and so on. These women have their own resources and they're sharing them generously. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna are Jesus' patrons. That's why their names are recorded, because they're playing such a big role in what's happening. Giving financial resources has been part of the church since the very beginning. When we give financially, good things happen. When we give, we recognize that everything comes from God, and then we become more mature and more responsible as human beings. When we give, we confront this culture's most powerful idol, which is money and all that money represents. When we give, our faith is deepened as we respond to God's graciousness. When we give, we celebrate God's abundance. When we give, we are partners in the larger vision of what God is doing in the world, and that brings a sense of satisfaction and fulfillment. When we give, we discover how wealthy we truly are. When we give, our commitment to God isn't just something we think about. It's something real and tangible and material. When we give, we grow in generosity. Our spirits enlarge, and that makes us much easier to live with ourselves, and easier to live with people who we share our lives with. When we give, we become more like God, who loved the world so much that he gave his Son. When we give, we follow Jesus' example, who showed us how much we are loved by giving his life for us. Giving financially is not just fundraising. When we give, we become Jesus' patrons and partners in his ongoing ministry. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna. They were the names on the list. They were the go-to people. They were the people who made a difference because they were willing to share what had been given to them. Good things happen when we give. Now, those are the 3 whose names we know. Let us meet a 4th woman whose name we do not know. Luke tells us she is a poor widow. Maybe she was old, but maybe she was young and had 5 kids. We don't know. And not all widows were poor. Roman law allowed women to inherit from their husbands. So the Apostle Paul also had patrons, and we are told that he was supported by wealthy widows. But this woman was not one of them. She is poor and she is a woman, and this makes her invisible to the social, religious, and political systems of the day. Nobody is polling her, asking her who she's going to vote for. She's one of those anonymous people who get overlooked, except by Jesus, who sees her in the midst of a crowd. She catches Jesus' attention. Jesus is on his last trip to the temple in Jerusalem. This is near the end of his life, and this is one of Jesus' last teachings. He's sitting across the temple treasury. He's observing people giving, and many wealthy people are giving. But then he sees this widow drop in her 2 small copper coins. These are leptas, the smallest denomination of coin. And Jesus calls his disciples over. Hey, you don't want to miss what just happened. And he looks at her again and turns to his disciples. Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for all of them contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she has to live on. Those last words in Greek, all she has to live on, really make a difference, because that sounds like she put in all her money. But if you look at it in the Greek, what it says is panto ton bion, her whole life. She gave her whole life. Now, Jesus doesn't reject the gifts of the wealthy. He is not critical. And Jesus is not critical of her giving to the temple. Although Jesus did have issues with certain religious authorities, he did not have any issues with the temple or the people who came to worship. Instead, Jesus calls attention to the widow so that the disciples then and disciples now will see that she's different than everyone else. She's unique. She's unique because she gives her whole life. Giving is total, unguarded, not calculated. She gives her whole life in a concrete, physical act of relinquishment. Her giving is a public proclamation that she loves God more than money. Her giving is complete self-giving, and it is something especially appropriate at the temple, because her giving is an act of worship. It's an act of doxology. There is a direct connection between our giving and what we worship. We worship whatever we give our lives to. You can tell quite easily what you or who you are worshiping by looking at your calendar. What do you do with your time? Who are you giving it to? To what are you giving your time? You can tell who you worship by your record of your bank account. Where is it going? To whom are you giving it to? We can worship all kinds of things, in part or in whole. We can worship our careers. We can worship a certain lifestyle. We can worship our families. We can worship our politics. We can worship ourselves. We can worship money and all that it represents. Whatever we worship defines us more than anything else. Whatever we worship shapes us and directs us and determines what we're going to do with the time that we have. We worship whatever we give our lives to. This widow is the ideal disciple. Jesus presents her to his other disciples and to us and says, look at her. Look at how she lives. Look at what she does. She gives all she has without hesitation. She epitomizes appropriately placed commitment. She models for the wealthy that the amount given is of less value than the percentage of income it represents. Jesus praises her for her truly self-sacrificial giving. She gives her whole life because her whole life depends entirely on what she gives. So today is Stewardship Sunday, and frankly, I'm not asking you to do exactly what this poor widow did. I'm not asking you to empty your accounts and give it all away. But what I am asking you to do is to give as an act of worship. I'm asking you to be thoughtful and intentional in your giving. And it's not as much about how much your pledge is or how it fits into your budget. It's more about who do you give your life to. Realize that when you make a pledge, it's not a pledge to the church. We'll keep track of it, and we'll monitor how you're doing. But we know it's a pledge to God. This is something between you and God. Earn all you can. I mean, go for it. Go out there and hit a home run and live on 80% of it. Save all you can. Sock it away. Don't touch it. The miracle of compound interest. And give all you can. As an act of worship. Saying something to God, but just as importantly, saying something to yourself. This is who I am, and you are the one I give my life to.